So hello, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all the participants. Thank you for joining us today at the regional briefing in preparation for the 8th Biennial Meeting of States on the Program of Action on Small Arms and Light Weapons in all its aspects. It's a pleasure to host you today on behalf of the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research, UNIDIR, and United Nations Office for Disarmament Affairs, UNODA. My name is Katja Böttcher. I'm the Political Affairs Officer at the United Nations Regional Center for Peace, Disarmament and Development in Latin America and the Caribbean, UNLIREC. I have just recently joined in March, and it's a pleasure to welcome all of you to today's meeting. UNLIREC is one of the 3 regional centers of UNODA, so it's we are all part of the same family. Some housekeeping before we start, perhaps first of all, to say interpretation is available at the bottom of your screen. You have a little sort of ball icon, which is a globe. There you can switch to Spanish if you prefer to listen to this meeting today in Spanish. So interpretation will be provided from English to Spanish and also from Spanish into English. I would also like to reassure the participants that you've come to the right place and that we are not going to keep you much longer than 1 hour today. So this meeting will feature a couple of presentations followed by a Q&A session. Cameras and microphones will be off today throughout the webinars, but participants are encouraged to use the Q&A function that's also at the bottom of your screen. There you can post any questions you may have throughout the event, and if time permits, we will then relay this question to the floor, and it would be great if you could indicate your name and your affiliation when you post those questions, which makes it a little easier for us to get back to you. If any questions today will remain unanswered, we will follow up with the panelists and also provide responses bilaterally after the event. Please note that this meeting today is recorded and will be made available on the UNIDIR website and also will be made available at the UNIDIR YouTube channel. So if you have a colleague who should watch it later and can't join today, they can watch it back as well. We hope that technology will be with us today, but in case there is a problem, because it's not perfect and we've been 2+ years in the pandemic using those platforms, but just in case there is a problem, we will close down the meeting and launch it again, and then you will receive in a moment a new email with a new link. So it just takes a couple of minutes, but just in case we have a backup plan. Otherwise, this is a secure platform and all participants have joined us using personalized links. I would also like to stress that UNIDIR promotes the core values of the United Nations, and so does UNODA and UNLIREC. Those are integrity, professionalism, and respect for diversity. And as such, we are committed to convening diversity in voices and opinions, which includes this meeting. And nonetheless, the views expressed during the events are those of the individual panelists, and they do not reflect the opinion of the United Nations UNIDIR as a whole. So those are just or sponsors or state members for that matter of fact. So with the housekeeping sort of past and beyond us, we can move into the substantive session of the meeting. We understand the importance of enhancing and syncing and also exchanging ideas in the run-up to the 8th Biennial Meeting of States of the Program of Action and the International Tracing Instrument, which will take place in New York in pretty much exactly 2 weeks today, from the 1 week today, from the 27th of June to the 1st of July. So it's literally around the corner. And many of you will gather in New York next week. The national, regional, and global implementation of the PoA and the ITI are key contributing elements to the comprehensive control of small arms and light weapons throughout their life cycle, as well as they are able to help prevent diversion and misuse of those weapons. So to support the preparations, I would like to say thank you to all the member states, to UNIDIR and to UNODA for co-organizing this a series of online briefings, which are actually undertaken for all the regional groups the UN has. So this particular one is for Latin American and Caribbean states, but they do take place for other regional groups over the coming days as well. Each briefing will begin with a panel discussion and some presentations, and then it will be followed by a brief discussion. And we hope that today's event and the series as a whole will contribute to enhancing the dialogue in some critical aspects of the PoA implementation at various levels and in different regions. And I welcome you to share this space today with us for some thoughts and preparations for BMS 8. With that, I will not take up too much of your time, and we will go straight into the opening video message from the chair designate of BMS 8, His Excellency Ambassador Mr. Enrique Manalo from the Philippines. Thank you.
Good morning, afternoon, evening, delegates. I thank the UNIDIR and UNODA for organizing this regional briefing for each of the 5 regional groups of the United Nations. As BMS 8 is fast approaching, this regional briefing was designed to stimulate thinking and exchange of ideas on substantive issues in preparation for the 8th Biennial Meeting of States on the PoA and ITI, scheduled to take place in New York from 27 June to 1 July 2022. I believe this regional briefing is important and would be helpful to delegates, especially those new to the portfolio, to be better reminded of the key issues and outcomes of BMS 7, to have an overview of the highlights in the PoA/ITI implementation, to zero in on key concerns relating to international cooperation and assistance, and to be more keen on other possible important issues for consideration at BMS 8 and the 4th Review Conference. In the past several informal consultations on BMS 8, I have had the good fortune of having smooth and fruitful discussions with delegations. Your substantive inputs have helped the chair shepherd the group to coming up with progressive versions of the outcome document in the last several weeks. I hope we continue this momentum until the week itself of BMS 8. In this regard, I wish your region a fruitful discussion on BMS 8 over the next hour, and I look forward to seeing all of you in New York next week. Thank you, and good day to all.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing this message, and also thank you to the Permanent Mission of the Philippines, and in particular, of course, to the chair, Ambassador Manalo, for his support and also the great interest he has shown during the preparation of these briefings, as well as promoting multilateral conversations on effective implementation of the PoA. And we just heard BMS 8 will have a focus on international cooperation and assistance. So maybe we keep that in mind as we go through our program this morning. Next, I'm delighted to welcome Mr. Ivor Fung, the Deputy Chief of the Conventional Arms Branch at the United Nations Office for Disarmament Affairs, for a few remarks today. The floor is yours.
Good morning, distinguished participants. Thank you, Katia. On behalf of the UN Office for Disarmament Affairs, I wish to welcome you to this very important event. And I would like to start off by thanking UNIDIR, especially the Conventional Arms Program, with which we are organizing this series of briefing. The series of briefing are intended to prepare delegations for BMS 8. We believe that when delegations are given an opportunity beforehand to familiarize themselves with the issues and with the process of BMS, they participate more substantively, more actively. The GRULAC, the group of Latin America and Caribbean states, is a very important group in moving things when it comes to the program of action, ITI implementation processes. You've just listened to the remarks by the chair designate of BMS 8. He has put emphasis on active participation. Your group is already participating very actively in all the preparatory work that we're doing, informal consultations. So I wish to commend you for that and encourage you even further, especially those of you in your capitals, to participate fully. Either we are talking of international cooperation, which is the focus of BMS 8, or other issues. For instance, the issue of recent technologies in weapons design, which is an important area. For those of you who were at BMS 7, you must have understood that there is the idea of maybe doing something that would capture or that will focus and address the issue of new technology. That is going to come up again, and BMS 8 is very much expected to make progress in this area. The issue of international cooperation is also very much important, and it's not just because it's the focus of this meeting, it's also because under that, you would be looking at assistance from the point of view of a fellowship program proposal that has been made since 2018. You'll be looking at it, how that is going to unfold would depend on the will of state, the active participation from their end. So there's going to be many issues, but the important thing is that the BMS process is not a static process. It's dynamic. And even though BMS 7 just held last year and the 2 years interval has not been observed, which usually allows states to accumulate implementation actions that they would bring to BMS. But most of the issues that were carried forward from BMS 7 would be there, and it would be for you to look at them and always bear in mind that these processes require action. They require progress. And we from the Secretariat, we will do everything to facilitate your work, and we look forward to a BMS 8 that is result-oriented. I thank you all, and I hope to see some of you in New York next week. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ivor, for those opening remarks and for sort of touching up on a couple of the key issues, which I'm sure we will hear more about in the next few minutes. With that, I'll sort of start introducing the panelists or hand over to the first panelist, perhaps, which is my colleague from UNIDIR, Dr. Paul Haltom, who will provide us with an overview of the key issues and outcomes of BMS 7. You have the floor now, Paul. Thank you.
Thank you, Katia, and thank you, Ivor. On behalf of UNIDIR and the Conventional Arms and Ammunition Programme, I'm delighted to be part of this great collaborative work with the Office for Disarmament Affairs and its regional centres, and in this session, UNLIRIC. Dear participants, good morning. It's a great pleasure to be with you all today. I'm sorry in advance that my slides are only available in English, but you have wonderful interpreters that I know will make my words sound far better and more eloquent in Spanish than they will in English. For today's briefing, I'll provide a scene setter for the subsequent presentations that will help with preparations for BMS 8. What I'll do is I'll highlight some of the key issues and outcomes from the 7th Biennial Meeting of States, BMS 7, as outlined on this slide. I'll therefore touch upon the issues of diversion, measurability and implementation, peace, security and sustainable development, connections with the International Tracing Instrument on implications of developments in manufacturing, technology and design, and as has just been mentioned, the importance of international cooperation and assistance. And I'll conclude with a brief summary of the BMS 7 outcome document. Now, I know from seeing the list of participants in this briefing that there are so many experts on the program of action that I'm not sure that I need to tell you this, but in 2001, UN member states adopted the program of action to prevent, combat and eradicate the illicit trade in small arms and light weapons in all its aspects. And then in 2005, the General Assembly adopted the International Tracing Instrument, or ITI, which specifically provides a framework for cooperation in weapons tracing and thus fulfills one of the main commitments of the PoA for member states. The program of action also included provisions for a periodic review of implementation. And for this, we have the BMS, or Biennial Meetings of States, the RevCon, or Review Conferences, and ad hoc meetings of governmental experts, or MGEs. We've tried to indicate on the timeline at the very bottom of this slide the previous meetings of governmental experts, BMS and review conferences, and you can see also the upcoming BMS 8 and the 4th review conference in 2024. And as I've already mentioned, we have an unusual situation that we have annual rather than biannual meetings for 7 and 8 due to COVID. I thought it would also be useful for today's briefing to show a snapshot of the BMS 7 mandate on this slide. Last year's Biennial Meeting of States, and indeed this year's too, provides an opportunity to review implementation of the PoA and the ITI. But BMS 7 focused on preventing and combating the diversion and the illicit international transfer of small arms and light weapons to unauthorized recipients. And therefore, I thought it appropriate to begin my briefing by looking at the issue of diversion. I wanted to begin by underlining that BMS 7 recognized that there are diversion risks at each stage of the life cycle of a weapon. That is manufacture, before and during transfer, post-delivery storage in stockpiles, end use or disposal. It also indicated the situations in which the illicit transfer to unauthorized recipients can take place: cross-border trafficking without appropriate authorization, unauthorized state retransfer, and the violation of arms embargoes imposed by the Security Council. I wanted to underline or highlight that the PoA is an instrument that contains provisions to prevent, combat, and mitigate the risk of diversion at each of these stages in the life cycle. It calls for the states to exercise effective control over the whole life cycle of small arms and light weapons in all its aspects, from manufacture through export, import, transit, transshipment, retransfer, and brokering within a state's jurisdiction, providing for the safe, secure, comprehensive, and effective management of stockpiles through measures such as adequate marking, record keeping, inventory management, and accounting control measures. BMS 7 also advocated a whole of government approach to mitigating diversion risks, which I think is worth underlining here too, as well as encouraging the strengthening, where consistent with domestic laws, of long-term, standardized, systematic, and disaggregated data collection to help with analysis, which in turn should help with ensuring that effective measures are put in place to prevent, combat, and mitigate the risk of diversion. In this regard, some of UNIDIR's recent work on preventing diversion, and in particular the diversion analysis framework, I think can be helpful for member states in this regard. Something that I think is a rather newer topic than diversion, and something that's been discussed in recent PoA meetings, is the issue of trying to focus on increasing understanding of progress in implementation of the PoA and the ITI, what works and what has worked to tackle the illicit trade in small arms and light weapons in all its aspects. Here, the discussions have looked at some of the traditional elements of the program of action, such as the use of national action plans on small arms and light weapons to tackle priority challenges. Also, the use of national reports for assessing progress and implementation. And of course, highlighting the importance of strengthening cooperation with civil society, youth, victims and survivors of armed violence, parliamentarians, industry, and the private sector. We've also had the sharing of experience and positive experience in some countries and regions, where there's consideration of establishing and using voluntary national and regional targets. And I'll come back to this issue in a moment when discussing international assistance. There's also been the promotion of the collection of disaggregated data by sex and age, which I'll touch upon now as well. Building on previous discussions within the PoA framework, the BMS 7 outcome document highlighted the benefits of connecting implementation of the PoA with global and national development efforts. At the global level, of course, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and its goals, targets, and indicators. In this regard, especially, but not only, Indicator 16.4.2. The discussions at BMS 7 also highlighted the various connections with the Women, Peace and Security, or WPS agenda, highlighting linkages in particular between national action plans and policies on small arms and the WPS agenda. There was recognition of calls to ensure the equal, full and effective participation of women in all policy, planning and implementation processes, mechanisms and fora. A call for data collection, where feasible, to be disaggregated by sex, age, and disability, to take account of the differing impacts of the illicit small arms trade and its negative consequences. And then, of course, to use this data to inform evidence-based, gender-sensitive policymaking and planning, as well as then exchanging experiences, lessons, and good practices in this regard. The discussions on the ITI called for member states to reinforce efforts to implement marking, record keeping, and tracing provisions of the ITI, regardless of the materials, design, or methods used for small arms and light weapons manufacture. The exchange of views on recent developments in manufacturing, technology, and design focused especially on polymer and modular weapons. Indeed, a proposal was made during BMS 7 to establish an open-ended working group to address challenges and opportunities for marking, tracing, and record keeping of polymer and modular weapons. This was contained in paragraph 100 of the outcome document, which called for consideration of this proposal at BMS 8. A vote was held on this particular paragraph, with 100 member states voting in favor, 1 voting against, and 10 abstentions. In addition, BMS 7 requested the Secretariat to develop a good practice document on marking practices for polymer and modular weapons, taking into account the views of all member states. As always in meetings on the Programme of Action, considerable emphasis was placed on the continuing importance of international cooperation and assistance to ensure the effective and comprehensive implementation of the PoA and the ITI. There are several provisions on ways to ensure and further strengthen comprehensive international assistance for life cycle management, including greater cooperation, coordination, and information sharing between all interested stakeholders. As mentioned a moment ago, the issue of voluntary national and regional targets was raised in connection with international assistance. It was highlighted how this could be used by member states to support their requests for assistance and for the mobilization of resources. As I mentioned, I think it can also help with identifying what works. BMS 7 also requested the Secretariat to present at BMS 8 funding and administrative arrangements for a dedicated fellowship training program to strengthen technical knowledge and expertise in areas related to the implementation of the PoA and ITI. And it also reminded us of existing UN assistance, such as the Secretary General's Saving Lives Entity Salient and the Trust Facility supporting cooperation on arms regulation, UNSCAR. Don't worry, Katja, I'm finished now, so this will be my final slide. And to conclude, I thought I could just give you a useful short summary of some of the key areas contained in the outcome document of BMS 7. Here highlighting the way in which the elements discussing the PoA look at the national level in terms of implementing PO provisions to prevent diversion, as I've mentioned, address the emerging challenges highlighted by Ivor in his earlier remarks, and to strengthen measurability and implementation of the PoA, as I just mentioned. At the regional level, there's encouragement for regional instruments, roadmaps, and action plans. And I know that there's a lot of work underway in this regard in the region of Latin America and the Caribbean. Calls also for promoting and strengthening cross-border and regional cooperation, and I know we'll hear more about this too. And at the international level, looking at conflict and post-conflict settings, armed violence, and broader peace, security, and sustainable development agendas. With that, I'd like to thank you all for your attention, and I look forward to hearing the remaining presentations and for your questions and responses. And as Ivor, I look forward to seeing those of you that will be in New York next week to discuss some of these issues in more detail. Thank you so much, Katia. The screen's back to you.
Thank you so much, Paul, for catching us up again or reminding us what the outcome document of BMS 7 entailed, and of course what states also committed themselves to looking at, both in terms of BMS 8, but also in terms of implementation at the national, global, and regional level. So this was very useful. And with that, I was supposed to turn over to my colleague, Julian Bustamante, but unfortunately he's unwell today. So I have kindly agreed to do the presentation where we look a little bit at some of the experiences and perspectives of the Latin American and the Caribbean states in regard to the program of action. And I will also share my screen with you, and I have a short presentation. Okay. Very good. All right. So just very briefly, in case there is a few of you who may not be familiar with the regional center of UNODA in Latin America and the Caribbean, called UNLIREC, and the full title is the Regional Center for Peace, Disarmament and Development in Latin America and the Caribbean States. The center is mandated to strengthen peace and security throughout regional disarmament in 33 countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. We've been established in the 80s, and member states have mandated the center to provide substantive support to initiatives and activities of the member states in this region, and to help implement measures regarding peace and disarmament, and also to promote economic and social development. UNLIREC is a unique UN entity because we have the mandate for disarmament, arms control, and non-proliferation, and we support states in achieving and maintaining the international instruments and treaties they have agreed to. There's over 20 people here at UNLIREC, and most of them are bilingual experts, and we've been working in almost all of the countries in the region. So how is the PoA relevant to the Latin American and Caribbean region? As we've already heard from Ivor in his remarks, states from these regions have always been strong and active supporters of the program of action process, and they have started that process in 2001 when Colombia chaired the conference, which then established the PoA, up to today, where states have always been very progressive advocates in the PoA process. Why is it so important, or how does the problem of small arms control or small arms challenges manifest themselves in this part of the world? They are actually linked with a lot of other illicit activities, and those include drug trafficking, which is perhaps the #1 challenge in the region, but they're also relevant to trends which we see on illegal mining. Of course, they relate to common crimes. We see that particularly relevant in the Caribbean states, but also in other states across the region. migrant smuggling, but also blackmailing of businesses, for example, for money in terms of protection. So why is it so important in the region? And let me just walk you very briefly, and I'm sure most of you are familiar with this, but I'll walk you through some of why I think this is a priority for states in the region and why they have actually been active supporters for so long. Latin America and the Caribbean is considered one of the most violent regions in the world, unfortunately. They only hold 9% of the global population. However, approximately 40% of all homicides at the global level take place in Latin American and Caribbean countries. And we have some data from 2017 in which we see that the global average of homicides is 1.6 to 100,000 people. That's the global average. And if we look at some of the regional trends, we see that in Central America, we have 25.9 deaths per 100,000 in the population, 24.2 in South America, and 15.1 in the Caribbean. And this is really why this issue is so relevant in Latin America and the Caribbean. So combating illicit firearms trafficking remains a priority for almost all the states in the region, in particular as it relates to their own security agenda. And as I already said, there's a great proportion of homicides in the region, and we also have some data which indicate us that the majority of those homicides are actually committed with firearms, 54% globally, but in Central America, that's 69%, in the Caribbean, that's 65%, and in South America, 53.7%. So here again, we see that by far the majority of these homicides involve firearms in Latin America and the Caribbean. So I just touch upon a couple of these topics which were just introduced by Paul and break them down into how they are relevant to this part of the world. One is the issue of gender considerations. Here, like in all other parts of the world, we really see the differentiated impacts the small arms problems have on men, women, boys, and girls, and that's been championed in the region, both in the political processes, but also increasingly so in the implementation of efforts. The disaggregation of data during the data collection process is new at the global level, or newer. It's just over in the last few years, and states in the region have started to implement this, but of course there's a lot of room for improvement. We still see that data collection in general is insufficient to give us a better picture, but actually the disaggregation of data needs to be continued to be strengthened. The convergent agendas with the WPS agenda, the Women, Peace and Security agenda, is also a new discussion point, and there more work can also be done in the region. The region, for example, has the Spotlight, the UN-EU Spotlight initiative, which looks at the elimination also of the violence against women in particular, and there's a lot of convergence. But that Spotlight initiative, which runs in most Caribbean and Latin American states, for example, does not always include consideration of firearms in those crimes. Strengthened women participation remains an issue. Latin America and the Caribbean are always well represented by women in the political fora at the global level. However, when it comes to firearms control implementation efforts, women are still significantly underrepresented. And the last point here is that, of course, funding gender relevant initiatives and programs and projects remains insufficient, like in many parts of the world. We just heard about the issue of new technology, which has been on the global agenda for over 10 years, and states have agreed to look at this again at BMS 8 with a view to establishing an open-ended working group, which could provide some recommendation on how states want to take that forward at the global level. At the sort of regional and national level, we don't have particular data to showcase this. However, during our activities, especially with customs officials, we do see that there's an increasing interest because they do come across modular weapons, 3D printed weapons, ghost guns, converted weapons, and also firearms which have polymer frames. So while perhaps there needs to be done some more research on how the region is impacted by this issue, if you have the possibility to speak with customs official or border control officials, they keep seeing increasingly those kind of weapons, and they are also facing the challenges that they are harder to detect, for example, and of course some of these weapons are unmarked, so there's no records and there's no tracing, which is not possible, and that undermines the effectiveness of the implementation of the international tracing instrument. We also see some of the new approaches which are taken up in the region. And of course, illicit arms trafficking is transnational in nature. So some of these sub-regional and regional approaches are a welcome approach in the region. There's interest from both the international donor community, but also from the side of states to tackle the issue of illicit firearms trafficking from a regional and a sub-regional perspective, because they do realize that some of those things are not, cannot be implemented by one state in the region alone. So there's opportunities to embed national priorities into sub-regional contexts, and they can also provide new avenues for funding. And we see this manifest itself in the Caribbean Firearms Roadmap process, which after the Western Balkan Roadmap is only the second region worldwide, which has a sub-regional roadmap with national priorities sort of sit under that, and national action plans, which are now being developed, but they are all in support of a sub-regional firearms roadmap. It's aligned, and it will also conclude with the 2030 agenda for sustainable development, and the roadmap in the Caribbean also concludes by 2030. So that's really an avant-garde initiative in the region. And we are aware that some other regions are also looking at the possibility to develop such a sub-regional roadmap. National target setting, we've already heard. So states since BMS 7 have agreed that states can, at the voluntary level, set themselves targets in line with their national priorities. The way this would work is, and there again, we can go back to the roadmap, where you increase the measurability of implementation, because the PoA itself does not have that measurability built in. So if you have specific targets, you can set them at the national level, or if you have a regional or sub-regional roadmap, there you already have specific targets and indicators and can measure the implementation. And states are now free to do this, and then to report on this, which includes the PoA implementation. And a good vehicle apart from the national, apart from the regional roadmap, would be the national action plan. So if states develop a national action plan and make it measurable, that automatically is already reflecting their national priorities, and then they could report this to the global level through their national reports. We also see some of the new approaches where we need to look beyond the weapon seizures. For some time, weapon seizures have been the indicator for success in the region. You know, the state has seized X amount of weapons and that made it successful. However, the center now advocates for states to go beyond that and actually look at those seized weapons, trace them, and conduct criminal investigations after the seizure has taken place, so that actually the diversion points can become more visible, but also that, of course, criminals can be brought to justice for weapons trafficking. That could include mutual legal assistance between states and joint investigations. And I think states in the region are increasingly looking at this possibility, again, because they are aware of the cross-border nature of weapons trafficking. Very shortly, some of the challenges and pending old issues. Marking, we still see that in the region, import marking is not always taking place or insufficiently taking place. Marking, of course, is necessary for tracing and dismantling ultimately the trafficking schemes, because it allows to trace and it allows to create that evidence-based. So marking, especially import marking, could be further increased in the region. We also see that the arms control systems and also the documentation of legal weapon transfers could be further strengthened. That's in line with other instruments, of course, and many states in this region are party to the Arms Trade Treaty, not all, but many. And there again, we the center is also ready to support states in strengthening their licensing and authorization regimes, their registries, and documentation such as the end user certificates. Maybe just to conclude, in terms of PoA reporting, it is important for states to report on their implementation of the PoA and the ITI. However, the rate of reporting in the region is low this year, in particular, with Argentina, Bolivia, Colombia, El Salvador, Grenada, Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua, and Peru having reported. All the other states have not yet reported to the PoA, but they are encouraged to do so. They have a week until BMS 8, so maybe we'll see a few more reports, and that would be wonderful from this region, because they are relevant to measure progress and also identify some of the challenges with the PoA implementation. They foster national ownership and can also reaffirm the state's commitment to the PoA. And we know that in this part of the world, states do a lot on the implementation of the PoA. So it would be also demonstrating that progress through national reports. It provides a basis for information sharing across the region, but also globally, and action taking. And it promotes interinstitutional coordination, because we know when states report, they have to work across the different institutions to coordinate the collection of information, which they then report. And it, of course, it allows also an up-to-date and systematized information record. Also, that includes things like who is the focal point in the country on the PoA. So if somebody would like to get in touch with a particular state, that's usually the first point of contact. And it would always be great to have the up-to-date information in that regard. It can also identify challenges and needs for international cooperation and assistance, is an input to the biannual meeting and also other multilateral fora, and contributes very importantly to the 2030 agenda for sustainable development, particularly the reporting on SDG indicator 16.4.2. And I've included here the link, but I can also we can also include it again in the chat, where states will find all the information for this year to submit their national reports. With that, I'll thank you for your attention. And if there's any questions, of course, I'll be happy to answer them. Okay, and now I'll switch hats again and sort of take over as chair from the presenter. And I would like to invite the civil society organization Alianza to provide us with who are involved very actively in the preparations and also usually during the BMS meetings. They are the focal points, the NGO focal points during those meetings. And I'll hand over to, just see, oh yeah, Ivan Marquez from the International Action Network on Small Arms Alianza, followed by Maria Pia Devoto. Thanks, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you, Katia. It's a pleasure for IANSA to be part of this regional briefing in preparation for BMS 8. Mis disculpas a los hermanos en Latinoamérica y el Caribe por la presentación en inglés, pero así seguimos. I'd like to start by thanking UNIDIR for the invitation, but especially for coming up with a great way to level organizations and stakeholders in the ramp up to BMS, and of course, for always promoting opportunities to hear from civil society. IANSA is a global hub for local, national, and regional civil society organizations working in any form of small arms violence reduction, and it is the civil society coordinator for this BMS. Today, I'll have the pleasure to share my time at this event with a representative from the region. But before passing the microphone to our member representative, I'd like to share one overarching thought on how to make progress in addressing these different topics for the effective implementation of the PoA and ITI, and present 6 issues that were identified by IANSA that should be part of the conversation next week. All 6 key civil society issues promoted by IANSA in this BMS 8 focuses on previous progress. Each biennial meeting of states or review conference has provided material and precedents for the meetings that follow. It is then critically important that the previous outcome documents serve as a floor for the consideration of proposals and not a ceiling. The illicit trade, proliferation, and misuse of small arms and light weapons for violence and crime are changing, and states need to address those changes. Millions of people around the world continue to be affected by violence and abuses committed or facilitated by the irresponsible use of such arms. So without further ado, these are the key issues IANSA has identified as needing particular attention at BMS 8. The first one is building on the gender outcomes of RevCon 3 and BMS 7 and ensuring inclusion of survivors and youth. As originally approved, the PoA gave little attention to affected communities and underrepresented groups. The words gender, youth, and survivors were not even included in the 2001 text, for example. Through the efforts of civil society and our diplomatic partners, we've made significant progress on inclusion in the last several years, but there is much more work to be done. In addition, advocates of inclusion have had to counter the contention of some states that these issues are somehow secondary to the implementation of the PoA. Second, enhancing measures for the collection and destruction of small arms and light weapons and their ammunition. Timely destruction of illicit, obsolete, and surplus small arms and light weapons and ammunition is a primary method of preventing the excessive and destabilizing accumulations of such material and ensuring it will not be diverted to illicit markets or to unauthorized end users or end uses. Securing legal stockpiles and decommissioning illicit, obsolete, and surplus weapons is important and can decrease the risk of diversion. The third key issue identified by IANSA is moving forward on developing national targets for implementation of the PoA. Another positive development included in the BMS 7 outcome document was the proposal that individual states consider setting voluntary national and regional targets to support implementation of the PoA and ITI. This suggestion to develop national targets was based on the Secretary General's recommendation in his 2019 report, in which he argued that the urgency and the character of the small arms issue is so diverse around the world, there can be no right or wrong national ambition level. Fourth, ensuring attention to synergies among instruments that are critical to preventing small arms and light weapons proliferation, violence, and harm. One of the most contentious issues in the PoA process in recent years has been the extent to which outcome documents should acknowledge potential synergies between PoA and other instruments. The illicit arms trade is a complex issue involving a wide range of potential factors, including types of weapons and ammunition, actors, diversion routes, and payment types. Taking advantage of synergies among relevant international as well as regional instruments that address the trade in small arms and light weapons can help increase their collective power to help control this trade and reduce its human cost. Fifth, increasing attention to the need for sustainable international cooperation and assistance in implementing the PoA and the ITI. The countries with the greatest need often have the fewest resources. A common response to this situation is to view international cooperation and assistance as something that flows from wealthier countries to less wealthy ones. But it's also possible to have cooperation among countries with high levels of resources. And importantly, there's also the possibility of peer-to-peer cooperation between and among countries that have fewer material resources. One good example is the creation and/or improvement of information sharing mechanisms based on information already available from existing registers, even if incomplete or unleveled between participants. Finally, setting a robust agenda and mandate for RevCon 4. One of the key tasks for BMS 8 will be establishing a mandate for the 4th Review Conference on the Program of Action and the International Tracing Instrument, which is scheduled to be held in 2024. RevCon 4 offers a critically important opportunity to propose programs and actions to improve implementation of the PoA and ITI. For more information on all of these 6 issues, please refer to IANSA's upcoming publication on topics to be considered in the BMS 8. I now proudly pass the floor to my colleague, Maria Pia Devoto from CELAC and APP. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Iván. Muchísimas gracias, UNIDIR y UNODA, por la posibilidad de poder compartir algunos pensamientos con ustedes en relación a las prioridades de la región para la BMS. Creo que Katia ya dio un panorama de cuál es nuestra situación, una gran cantidad de homicidios cuando tenemos poca población, en esos homicidios, o sea, la mayor parte del mundo en esos homicidios, una gran participación, 3 veces más participación de armas de fuego que el promedio global, y además los países de nuestra región enfrentan también niveles de violencia no letal. Estamos incluyendo, o sea, el crimen organizado, la delincuencia organizada, la trata de personas, violencia sexual, robos, uso excesivo de la fuerza por parte de las policías, ¿no? Está este nuevo fenómeno de la privatización de la seguridad con las empresas de seguridad privada. Y en el tema de las mujeres, para tener una idea de cuál es la dimensión de género, de qué es lo que experimentan las mujeres en nuestra región, es que 1 de cada 4 mujeres entre 15 y 49 años ha sido víctima de violencia física o sexual por parte de su pareja en algún momento de su vida. Y si bien, como en todo el mundo, la gran mayoría de los que mueren son hombres y jóvenes, casi el 60% de las mujeres que son asesinadas por sus parejas íntimas o exparejas, tenemos ese número, ¿no? El 60%, ¿no? Y tienen una participación como muy pequeña las mujeres en el tema de la tenencia de armas. Entonces tenemos como un cóctel que hay una fácil accesibilidad a las armas, proliferación de armas de fuego, fronteras porosas, pobreza, inequidad, corrupción, pandillas, falta de oportunidades. Todo eso hace en la región un cóctel mortal. Hay distintas realidades con respecto a las armas de fuego en los distintos países. Incluso podríamos hablar de algunos fenómenos subregionales que comparten estas subregiones algunos desafíos similares. No es lo mismo lo que sucede en América del Sur, en América Central, en el Triángulo Norte, lo que sucede en el Caribe, o lo que puede suceder en el caso particular de México. En América del Sur, yo soy de Argentina, estamos experimentando distintas y diferentes aproximaciones al tema de las armas. Por un lado, tenemos el anuncio del nuevo presidente de Chile anunciando un proyecto para la prohibición expresa por parte de civiles de armas. En Brasil tenemos algunos decretos que han facilitado el acceso de armas y actualmente se está discutiendo la modificación de la ley que fue un gran éxito de la sociedad civil allá en los 2000, la ley de control de armas y municiones, y la semana pasada, recientemente, ha sido promulgada en Perú la ley de comités de autodefensa, la CADE, en la cual se permite adquirir armas para actividades de autodefensa a la comunidad, ¿no? Y este no es un fenómeno nuevo del Perú, ya está sucediendo en algunos otros países, como el caso de Colombia, hay casos en Nicaragua, hay casos en Venezuela. En la región tenemos a México, que está atravesando un impacto de la violencia armada sin precedentes por la actuación del narcotráfico, de los carteles. Se estima que entre el 70 y el 90% de las armas confiscadas provienen de Estados Unidos y del tráfico ilícito de Estados Unidos, ¿no? Según los datos proporcionados por la Agencia de Alcohol y Tabaco y la ATF, y que en promedio llegan a México unas 500.000 armas al año. Estos carteles del crimen que operan en México son los que proveen de armas a Guatemala y de allí a El Salvador, Honduras y Belice, y como que va derramando al resto de la región. Si pensamos en el tema de las fronteras, solo con Guatemala hay 17 entradas oficiales y 97 entradas informales, de las cuales 45 son las entradas de las armas preferidas de estos grupos criminales, ¿no? Las AR-15, las M-16, las K-47, como van cambiando los controles, también se van adoptando. Están también algunos puertos que ya están identificados en el caso de Honduras. Por eso hay que centralizarse en el tema de las fronteras, ¿no? Y todas estas armas, y las maras en El Salvador, cuando hablábamos de la seguridad privada, El Salvador tiene 500.000 empresas de seguridad privada, ¿no? Entonces, las pandillas en El Salvador fueron mutando de lo que era un delito del control del territorio y algún delito eventual a delitos asociados a expandirse y a convertirse en pandillas transnacionales. Entonces, sabemos que México está llevando adelante este proceso sin precedentes de demandar a 11 empresas en la Corte de Massachusetts, a 11 empresas fabricantes de armas de Estados Unidos por prácticas comerciales negligentes. Desde APP y desde CELAC nos constituimos en amicus para colaborar con México en este esfuerzo. Bueno, el Caribe, el promedio de los homicidios es de 15 cada 100.000 habitantes, el fácil acceso a las armas aumenta la violencia armada y la seguridad en los distintos países de la región. Afirmó recientemente, bueno, es algo sabido, pero hace muy poco el coordinador del Consejo Nacional de Seguridad para el Caribe. Y además el tráfico ilícito, no tanto de armas y de drogas, está asociado a estos países como países de tránsito. Si bien también aumentan en los propios países, son un típico país de tránsito. Y por eso es importante esta iniciativa que está llevando adelante UNIDIR, que está asociada a la Agenda 2030, sobre la identificación de la ruta del tráfico de armas y municiones. Entonces cobra importancia para la región y creo que es una iniciativa que se podría pensar y buscar, que vamos a estar hablando en la BMS sobre cooperación internacional, poder replicarla en otras subregiones. Entonces el PoA nos ha dado y ha ofrecido a la región, como mostraba cuán importante puede ser para nuestra región, Katia, numerosas oportunidades para enfrentar los desafíos, ¿no? Los primeros años se reportaba, aunque no estuviera en el texto del PoA, los países de nuestra región y muchos países también reportaban sobre control civil como una herramienta efectiva. También luego tuvimos el instrumento internacional de marcaje y rastreo, ¿no? Quiero remarcar que para este instrumento, como una de las cosas más importantes como para todo, ¿no? Es el intercambio de información entre los estados. Algo que ha ido mutando dentro de las agendas y de los desafíos es el tema de la inclusión de la perspectiva de género, la discusión que tenemos hoy en día, el reconocimiento de la necesidad de la discusión sobre las municiones convencionales. América Latina y el Caribe son parte de todos y cada uno de los instrumentos regionales y globales, los los políticamente, pero hay una gran distancia en nuestra región cuando hablamos de efectiva implementación. Entonces, hablaba Iván del tema de las sinergias, ya termino en 2 minutos, el tema de las sinergias con otros instrumentos. Se habla mucho de las sinergias, pero compartir buenas prácticas como con CIFTA, como el espacio que hay del Grupo de Armas Mercosur, pero no hay mecanismos formales para poder intercambiar información de manera formal con estas sinergias. Hay trabajos y hay experiencias que ha habido en la región excelentes de cooperación, donde cooperan muchísimas agencias, ¿no? Tenemos la operación que lideró Interpol, la operación Trigger 6, que 13 países, numerosas agencias, mucha investigación, inteligencia, son ese tipo de medidas que nos permite colaborar dentro del marco del UNPOA y dentro del marco del IET. Entonces, la perspectiva de género, la destrucción de existencias, es algo permanente para no seguir alimentando al tráfico ilícito. Hace muy poco en mi país, en Argentina, la agencia implementadora, que es la MAC, destruyó 9 toneladas de municiones. Nunca en el país había sucedido una destrucción tan grande, ¿no? Intercambio de información, ya lo dijimos, manejo de arsenales, no solo de seguridad física, sino de capacitación para el manejo de arsenales, y la oportunidad, ¿no? Como ha disminuido el tema de los reportes, no sé, en menos de la mitad tenemos este año con respecto a 2018 en la región, pero la oportunidad que nos da la 4ª conferencia de revisión el 2024, ¿no? De poder rever, de poder ver los nuevos desafíos que tenemos como región, y desde qué lugar podemos comprometernos y cooperar, y cooperar entre nosotros para la implementación efectiva de los compromisos existentes, ¿no? Entre ellos el PoA y el ITI. O sea, son fundamentales si realmente queremos prevenir, combatir y erradicar el tráfico ilícito de armas pequeñas. Perdón lo rápido, perdón el desorden, pero quería compartir, aunque sean los minutitos que nos quedaban, estas reflexiones.
Thank you so much, Maria Pia, and also Ivan, for providing us with this important view, also at the much more localized level, and of course from civil society, and what priorities are seen from those representatives who really work on the ground very often, also with victims and survivors of armed violence, and who are important voices also in the PoA context. Thank you so much for that. I hope the interpreters, you know, they manage. I mean, I followed it in both languages and I think it was fine, but I guess they'll take a little breath now. Thank you so much. So I think I don't see any questions anybody had posed in the chat, and the hour is really also up. And maybe with Paul's permission, I just close the meeting. Okay, so, oh, I see a question, of course, very quickly. Good morning, from Gabriela Gonzalez. Let me see. The request for the sharing of the presentations and the PowerPoint. So I believe that, you know, this, yeah, okay. And she's also included, Maria Pia included her email in the chat. So you'll have also, if anybody wants to contact her, they can do that. I think, yeah, Paul, I'll leave it up to you if you would like to share the presentations. I don't think that anything speaks against that, because of course this link will also be available to the actual session this morning or this afternoon for colleagues who are in Geneva. So if everybody's in agreement, I think we can also share the presentations and the link with participants afterwards. Okay, well, thank you so much. I hope this was useful for the preparation of BMS 8. I would like to thank all the participants for joining us and for making available their time to listen to the great panelists we've had today. Thank you for Ivor, also by extension to Ambassador Manolo. Thank you to Paul, Ivan, and Maria Pia for your contributions today. It was really, an interesting exchange, and I think there is a lot of momentum because the past meeting has just taken place. There's a lot of momentum going into the meeting next week, and I look forward to following it from Peru, where UNIDIR is based, and to see what the outcome will hold for us to also maybe important, and that wasn't mentioned yet, but maybe also important for states then to know that this is the last meeting before the review conference, and a lot of those tracks will then lead to the review conference. So with that, I thank you very much. I hope it has contributed to the preparations, and I wish all those who are traveling to New York for BMS 8 a successful meeting next week. Thank you so much.